Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for 15-Minute Fridays this week. And I'm very, very excited because I'm having a little bit of a fangirl moment because I have one of my favourite authors joining us in the form of Josephine Moon. Josephine, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so excited.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure. I'm happy to be here. I'm fangirling right back at you. Don't worry.
The very first book I read of yours was your very first book, The Tea Chest, and it's one of my favourites, I think. Here it is here. You can see the spine quite well used there. And I've got all of your books, and I'm so thrilled that you're here today. And we're going to be talking about something that doesn't get a lot of airtime in the writing and reading space, and that is setting. Before we go to that, though, because I always forget everything that I am supposed to do, I'm going to pop up what our giveaway is so that anyone who makes a comment or asks a question will be in the running to win a copy of your book from last year, The Gift of Life, and a copy of The Cottage at Rosella Cove. And of course, because anyone who knows me knows I love my chocolate, we'll throw in some chocolates as well. So for anyone out there, if you ask a question or make a comment, you'll go in the draw for that. And I'll leave that open until midnight Saturday night, just for anyone who's watching this back at a later time. If you make a comment, they will still count as well. So, Josephine, let's get into it. Oh, we've got a couple of people joining us. I'll just pop those up here so we can see. Michelle says hello. And Malvina is joining us as well so far. Yes, we're very happy to be with each other too, Malvina. So setting, Josephine, this is something that is very important to each of us as writers. And it's something that, as I said, it doesn't get a lot of airtime. People talk about character and they talk about plot, but they don't always talk about setting. And I wanted to discuss with you today, what is it about setting for you that makes it such an integral part of your novels?
It's a really good question, and it is such a massive part of my novels. And I think as a reader and as a writer, it's very important. And I think readers and writers, it's a very personal thing how much detail people want in terms of setting. So some readers and writers have said outright to me that setting is nothing to them. They don't care about it at all. Whereas for me, it's very much a character in and of itself, and it shapes so much about what my characters can and can't do. So for me, I will always choose, people often ask me, well, how do you choose where you set a book? And for me, it's really important that I always look for somewhere that's very beautiful and very inspiring and very evocative for a couple of reasons. One, because I'm going to spend a lot of time there in my head, so it's going to make it more enjoyable for me to go back there day in, day out. And I think by extension then it makes it more enjoyable for the reader to go back to that place as well. So I spend a lot of time building little worlds in a lot of detail. So wherever possible, I'll go and research on location where I'm setting my stories, and I will walk streets and I'll draw out maps, and I'll often just do what I call a little Harry Potter trick where I'll put in all the shops along that street, and then I'll just pop up an imaginary store in between, which is, one of my characters' stores, so the chocolate shop or the tea shop or whatever it is. It sort of sits in that specific space there. But yeah, it's actually the first thing I choose when I start working on a novel is my food theme, because I'm foodie lit, and then my second is setting. So until I have those two things sort of nailed down and built up quite a lot, I've got no characters and no plot. So it's like, for me, I have to set a little stage, like in a theatre, and then I let people walk in, and how they interact with their space is really important.
Yeah, right. That was actually going to be my question, which comes first, your characters or your setting? So it's for you, it's setting.
Yeah, so I definitely go from outside in like that. I sort of start with the outside world, and it gets sort of more and more narrow as we get into the character inside that space. And I think people think setting is very much about a place, and it is, but it's a lot more than that too, because of course it's context, it's the time, and it's whatever socio-cultural things are going on in that space at that time as well. And whether you're poor or whether you're wealthy or whether you're educated, all those things all interact together to create that little microcosm.
Yeah, and I'm a firm believer that if you set the book in a different place or time, it will absolutely change how the characters interact with each other, react to their situation. And for me, it is very much an important part of that because, my books are all set in small country Australian towns. They're all fictional, which has its pros and cons when you're writing them. But if they were set in big cities, it would be a very different interaction between those characters.
Absolutely. And I don't know about you, I'd be interested to know how you feel about that, because I am a small town girl at heart. So I grew up in Brisbane, but I grew up in the burbs, but as soon as I could, got out of there to the country in a very rural space to start with, and now I'm in a small country town as well. And so that's where I feel comfortable, and that's how I interact with the world, is through that space of that sort of smaller community. So, I'd be interested to know how you feel about that, whether you think, your love of those towns drives that particular setting as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up in Coffs Harbour, which is on the north coast of New South Wales, and it had 25,000 people when I was growing up. It's a much bigger place nowadays. And so, all of my youth was spent in and around, the towns around Coffs, travelling for, tennis tournaments or netball or whatever it might be. And I'm so used to that sense of community. And I live in Sydney now, and it's a very different experience. I find living in Sydney, the way you know your neighbours is a very different experience when you live in a big city. And so for me, those small towns are a comfort to me. I love going back into them, even though they're fictional. They ring true of the small towns that I knew growing up. And I find the comfort in going back into those places. And I find it gives me a fair amount of flexibility in terms of my characters, because, as you would know, Josephine, in a small town, everybody does know everybody. Mm-hmm. And when you've got that kind of scrutiny, it gives you a lot more of a canvas, I think, to play with those characters within that setting. Whereas if it was set here in Sydney where nobody knows anybody, I don't think you can have that same interaction.
Absolutely. And people very much develop, their level of sort of, I guess, defensiveness. It depends a lot on the location in which they're in as well. And so, that definitely affects how characters play out. Do you do location scouting, even though your places are fictional? Do you do location scouts as well?
Not actively. My mum still lives in Coffs Harbour, and my husband's family are in Parks, which is where The Dish is, if you've ever seen the movie The Dish. So I'm constantly travelling through and to small towns, and often when we're on these long drives, it's like 6 hours north to my mum and 6 hours west to my husband's family. We'll pass through towns and we'll stop and have lunch or whatever it might be, and often things will hit me and I might jot things down. So in my first novel, The Kookaburra Creek Cafe, the small town that Alice originally comes from, Lawson's Ridge, is very much inspired by those towns in Western New South Wales that I know from my in-laws, and being out that way. And in the current book, The Banksy Bay Beach Shack, it feels very much like Coffs Harbour to me. Even though it's not Coffs Harbour, it's kind of got that feel about it. So it's never conscious. I don't get to travel like you do for the sake of my art. For the Cake Maker's Wish, which is set in the Cotswolds, you actually went there, didn't you, to research that?
I did. It was a huge trip. My son was quite young at the time, and we were renovating a house, and so it was a big deal to go at that time, but I really felt like I needed to go over there. And I was looking, I'd been published in the UK, so, it was a nice tax-deductible excuse to go over there as well and to research and meet up with my publisher and agent over there. And I just knew I would love the Cotswolds, because, anyone who's seen enough photos of the Cotswolds or seen movies sort of shot in that location, those images are just iconic about how beautiful they are. So I knew I'd love it, but I didn't have a story at all. I was chasing a story, and I went there deliberately to find one. And I was just really lucky to stumble on what turned out to be, I think, a really good hook for a book.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I've left Donna's comment up here for a little while, and I think we might address it now. She loves books set in Australia. It gives her the chance to experience places that she probably would never get to. And I think that's a really interesting way we can connect with our readers, whether it's, towns in Australia or going overseas like you do with your characters. It does give our readers that chance to travel, I guess, without leaving home. And at the moment, that's particularly important, I think.
Isn't it? Such good timing for all these books that are set all around the world right now. Yes, it is armchair travel is wonderful, and I think you can learn a lot. Just like with historical fiction is really playing that role of sort of going back and teaching people about history. I think all the things that were sort of buried. It's one of the great things about historical fiction is they dig up these stories that weren't told. And I think it's a similar thing with places around the world too, that you can go there, and particularly if you do go as an outsider, you will see things very differently to how people who live inside that village will see them as well. So your version of that sort of location is unique to you, and so it's a story in and of itself as well. But yeah, I love a good trip to Italy or anything, anytime. Like in a book, take me to Italy or Ireland anytime, I'll be happy.
When you're doing that, Jo, because you write about real places in your novels, how much of a responsibility do you feel to portray them authentically?
It depends how well I think I know the place at all. So in terms of the one in the Cotswolds, it's based on one particular village and sort of then influences. So the Cotswolds is a group of villages, in a particular area. And so it's very easy to travel around the Cotswolds and see lots and lots of villages. So because I am not English and I do not live there, I did not feel comfortable saying, oh, this is such and such village. So for that one, I've based the village on a compilation of a number of villages, and then I've given it another name because I didn't want to offend people or upset people in particular. If it's something that I feel much more comfortable with, so if it's set in Melbourne, I've been to Melbourne enough, and I'm an Australian, and I feel like I have some degree of authenticity, yes, with the gift of life. Or in Tasmania, the first time I ever went to Evandale in Tasmania, I look at you, you're so prepared.
I told you I was a fangirl.
Thank you. The first time I went to Evandale, and I wasn't even published then, this was well before the tea test, I said, I'm going to set a book here. I just love it so much. And my dad and stepmother had a cottage down in Tassie, so I was sitting down there a lot, travelling, and just loved it. So I think it would probably, what would probably change is if I was portraying the place badly, and I tended not to. I tend to give good portrayals of a place, and if I was going to give it, maybe a less than favourable view, I might consider whether I want to name it and shame it specifically, or whether I give it a different name. So, but I think if I'm doing a pretty good job of saying, hey, this place is great, and I feel some degree of confidence and authority over it, like it's in Australia and I know it, then I'm happy to name it as it is. But yeah, so for that one in the Cotswolds, I just went, no, I don't live there. I don't feel like I can claim that one.
Okay. And you've done a very good job of it. Michelle here has a comment that Stone then felt so real. She's just finished The Cake Maker's Wish. And that's one of the things that if we're making up towns or compiling, towns that we've been to into this one fictional place, that it still has to feel like a real place. And that's something that I certainly, focus on when I'm creating my towns. And obviously you've done that here with Stoneden. What is it about these places, even though they're fictional, that feel real to readers, do you think?
Oh, good question.
How do we do that as writers?
Well, I think I was going to ask you, I don't know if you do this, but I spend quite a lot of time mapping out places, because I think that's one of the fundamental things, is that you're consistent from beginning to end about where things are, and that when you walk out of the chocolate shop and you turn right, that the park is down there, and if you turn left, then the bakery is down there, and not the other way around. So if it's very clearly defined and it's consistent, then readers will continually build up those images in their minds as well. And I will do things like my book next year is part of it is set in the Barossa Valley. And so when I go into my characters' homes, I will find homes on realestate.com that are in that area, and I'll choose one that I like, and I go, well, I'm going to put my character there, and then I'll have those images to refer to as well. So again, I have very concrete images I'm drawing on that I can go back to 3 months later and go, hang on, where was the kitchen in that house? And I can go back and find it, and I haven't then accidentally put it out in the bathroom where it shouldn't be, or something like that. So I think it's those very crystal clear details that are consistent. Do you do a map?
The other thing that I think helps add to the authenticity of it is not just the physicality of the location, but it's also things like smell and touch, those tactile things, the coldness of a stone or the warmth of the wood, or what the fish and chip shop smells like when you're walking past it at the beach. I like to try to infuse that into my stories as well, because I think that adds into that experience for the reader of really getting a sense of this place is a real place.
Yes, definitely. And really evocative things, like if a church bell rings every night at 7 p.m. or something, then that's very real. Or if the sheep, are barring every night on dusk, or things like that, you're absolutely right. It's building up those layers of senses, the five senses. That's how we experience the world around us, and that's how our reader experiences the world. So
yeah, and often those other senses are more powerful than our sense of sight. Our hearing and our smell and our taste often triggers memories far quicker than sight does, and if we can build that into these towns that we're creating, then it really does become a real place, I think.
Yes, and one of the things I always teach people when I talk about this stuff is smell in particular has such a strong connection to our emotional memory. And so it's a really useful tool to trigger memories in people. And if you need to sort of jump through time, it's a really good one. You smell the fish and chip shop and then all of a sudden you're back 30 years earlier, and it's a really nice transition point into that scene as well.
Yeah, it is. Debbie is loving this topic. Thank you, Debbie. We're very pleased to bring it to you. And she's saying that it is true what we say from a reader's point of view. I think it really helps solidify the readers into that place, and then they can really fall in love with our characters. Hopefully, really fall in love with our characters. So
yeah, I really admire. It's not my sort of jam to do it this way, but writers who can create settings that are actually not very palatable settings and yet still have these a lovely story going on within it. I mean, that's a serious craft, that I really admire that. I think that's a really
we've got a question here from Ben. Hi Ben, thanks for joining us. Where do you research when the place is set in the past and no longer there? That's a good question, Ben.
The internet mostly. So there's often, photos are left over, but people, which is where I stumbled across this great, resource in the Cotswolds, was that I sat down with a couple of men who'd lived there in their 70s, and they'd lived there since they were babies, and they'd lived there their whole life. So even though the village they knew as a child wasn't there anymore, they were telling me all about it. So people, if you can find people will always be your greatest resource more than anything else. But otherwise, it's just sort of, books, photos, that sort of general research, other people, historians who put that stuff together as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I've often used people, as you know, Jo, in my stories always have a dual timeline, and I go back into the past. So, it's the 60s with this book, it was the 40s with another book, next year's book is the 50s. And I was born in the 70s, so I haven't lived through those periods. And I've definitely called on, my mum and her friends and that sort of generation to help me fill in some of those gaps that Google, doesn't necessarily give us. And when you've got that coupled with all of that research that you can do, on the internet, I think you can build up a fairly good picture of what those places were like, if you're traveling back in time.
Absolutely. And so, it's that what's that word? It's verisimilitude when you're trying to get that, which means very similar. When you're trying to get, enough facts in there that make people comfortable that they're in the hands of somebody who knows what they're doing. It's making people feel like, yes, this person's done their research. I can relax now. I don't have to second guess what's going on. That's always a nice place to get to.
It is. It is. Malvina is saying that most of the places she's visited to, she's learned from books before. Yeah, it's nice to have that connection between what you're reading and if you ever get there in real life, putting them together is a nice thing too.
Yes, it is. And it was really nice. I had one of my loveliest compliments I ever got was in The Chocolate Promise. There is a small section set in France, and in rural France, and I hadn't been there to that particular town. But I had a friend of mine who had lived there for a year, and I'd written all my scenes, I'd done all my research, I'd done all the maps and the photos and everything. And then she happened to be getting on a plane to go over there, so I printed out those chapters, sent them over, and said, "Can you just check this is all right?" And it was all good. And then somebody from France a bit later had read it and emailed me and said, "Oh, your description of that village is exactly spot on. It was really great." So that was a big relief and a very nice compliment. But that's where that amount of research, pays off, is when someone who's been there can say, yes, right on.
And that's the thing. There's always going to be someone who's reading our books that knows. And it's really important then to get it right. So I had somebody with my latest one, the Banksia Bay Beach Shack, say that she grew up in a surfing town in the 1960s in Australia. And she said, "I nailed it." And I was so relieved.
Yes.
And she said that. So.
Well, I have to say too, when I was listening, because I do most things on audio, I was listening to a book on audio, and quite recently we have a magazine up here called Salt Magazine, because I'm quite close to the beach, and it's anyway, it had a whole profile, like 6 pages or something, on historical surfing in Noosa in that era, and I could see when I was listening to your, it was really similar. I could really visualize it, because I also had seen the photos from that magazine, but it really did ring true. You did a great job.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. We've got another question here from Ben. Do we treat setting like a character? How is it the same as a character, and how is it different? Ben's got some fantastic questions for us today.
It's good I had coffee before this chat. I think it is a character. It's a character in that it has a personality, and it has a history, and it has a future as well, and it very much influences the people around it. I guess the way it's different is that it doesn't have agency of it in and of itself, so it can't just change itself. Other people can change it, but it doesn't necessarily have that sort of the character arc that an actual human character would have. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much the only difference, because I don't know if you have this experience, but for me, my settings do actually talk to me, and I think they talk to the characters as well. And I'm trying to think of an example, and in the Banksia Bay Beach Shack, there is an old cheese factory on top of the headland that is completely abandoned and has been for decades and decades. But when Laura goes in there and walks around, she can kind of feel the history of it, and it's like the relics that are left behind are talking to her and telling a story. So so they can't do things, they can't change their arc, as you said, but I do think they can talk to us and talk to our characters, and and then in that way they're very much like a character of themselves, I think.
And a very helpful character too, because they hold secrets. Like your setting has things buried in it, and it's got scars, and it's got, it's hiding things as well. So your character, your setting can be incredibly helpful in driving your plot and giving you, clues or things just at the right time as well. Yeah, it's very useful.
It can also be the obstacle that the characters have to overcome, in a small town where they keep secrets, and they don't want to share those secrets. You wouldn't find that in other places, perhaps, where they kind of close their ranks and keep the outsiders away. And, so it can work, both for and against our characters, which adds another dynamic, I think, just like a real person would.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's so much more in this, isn't it? When you start unpicking it.
Yeah, I'm so not going to go to 15 minutes. There's no way. Oh dear. Oh, Claudine said she loves how prepared I am, because I've got all of my my Josephine Moon books here.
I know.
I'm going to digress from character, just from setting for one moment, and talk about Lincoln in The Chocolate Promise. I don't know if you saw the article I wrote last year on my favourite heroes, but Lincoln, oh my God, he still does it for me, even though it's been a couple of years since I read.
Don't worry. He's one of my favourites.
Yeah, no, he's gorgeous. If you haven't read The Chocolate Promise, you need to read it just for Lincoln, I think. So,
God is
talking about our covers and how pretty they are, and Yeah, they absolutely are. And I think this also ties into setting in a way, because setting isn't also just the town or the country that a story is set in. It could also be whether it's in a factory or a quilt shop or a cafe or a tea shop or those sorts of things. And I think our covers reflect that part of our story as well. And, you've had some fantastic settings, a tea shop, a chocolate shop, yum, the coffee shop in Melbourne, obviously the cake shop with your new story. So apart from the towns themselves, how do you pick what kind of shop is going into your books?
Yeah, another great question. I guess I get visual ideas I get my visual cues from, stores. So, for example, the chocolate shop in the Chocolate Promise was in a heritage building. So I went looking for, so the shop is called the Chocolate Apothecary. So I went looking for heritage buildings that were apothecaries. And then I took elements of those that I loved and put them in to this sort of more modern setting. And so she actually has from memory, it is an old apothecary, and then she renovates it and keeps, all the little drawers that the apothecary has and all those kind of cute little elements. Sometimes I don't know. So in the tea chest, the premise is that she has this beautiful tea shop in Brisbane, and then she has to go to London and set up a new one. And she had to style that tea shop from scratch. And I literally didn't know what it was going to look like for a really long time. I just kept writing, and they're renovating and doing all this stuff. And then I was lying awake in the middle of the night, sort of right before I had to write the scene. I was sort of like, well, I've got to open the shop. What is it going to look like? And it just popped into my head what it looked like, and which was, one of those sort of magical things that happens when you write books. You sort of throw the question out there and wait for it to come back. And it took its time coming back. And I just sort of kept writing, trusting it would turn up eventually. And it did. So sometimes I just don't know. I just wait, and then something turns up. But I'm a bit of a vintage fan, so things tend to have a vintage feel about my stores. Yeah, I think the coffee shop was fairly sort of modern, more on trend than some of my other stores. But yeah, I do lean towards the vintage for sure. But yeah, I basically look for photos. I search Pinterest or anywhere and just collect, and then when I find things I like, I sort of style things on that.
Mm-hmm. Michelle's touched on one of the joys of research, the wine and the food research, the coffee research, all of those sorts of things that we have to do when we talk about food in our novels. Yeah, it's another perk of the job, isn't it?
Absolutely. And people do often say, oh, do a wine book. But I've also said I'm never going to do a wine book because I don't have enough passion for wine, and I don't think I could fake that passion on the page. Yeah, my passion for food really comes through on the page. So I just don't think I can fake it, unfortunately.
Cassie would like to know, what is a typical writing day for you, Jo?
It has been one of those things that has changed and changed and changed. So when my baby was 6 weeks old when I first got my agent, and I had been writing for 12 years without a child, which would have made it a lot easier to suddenly have a professional career. So it was really odd timing. So it's changed every year from when he was a baby to a toddler to, et cetera, et cetera. So now that he's at school, though, and we have fairly regular hours, I try and be at my desk by 9 a.m. and I pretty much sit here until maybe 1. This is the ideal day, right? I stay and then, I get up for coffee breaks and whatnot in between. And then I'll go out, I'll go to the gym, and then I'll go out and just school run. And then it's, we have horses, we have 7 horses. So I spend a lot of time with the horses in the afternoon and doing all that stuff. And yeah, sometimes then I'll do sort of social media stuff or publicity stuff later at the night or something like that. But I try to keep that 9 to 1 space clear. But life being life, it definitely doesn't always work that way, COVID, well, suddenly you're homeschooling for 2 months, so that blew everything to pieces, and I really did not enjoy that very much, and had to kind of go back to how I was writing when he was a baby, which was really messily, and when I was tired and when I just didn't want to, and in horrible tiny snippets of time, and It was horrible. So I really enjoyed it when he went back to school, and now I'm back to some kind of regular hours. Yeah.
Okay.
I need a lot of space, and I need a lot of quiet, so I don't do a lot of noise going on.
Yeah. No, I'm very similar to you in that respect. We have a great question here from Claudine. You did a trip on the Garn not so long ago. Does this mean you're thinking about setting a book there?
You are on the ball, Claudine. Next year's book has a trip on the Garn. Or it's the Garn, actually. I keep saying Garn, and they will correct you. They'll correct you if you're on the train. It's the Garn.
Okay, Garn. Sorry. Yep.
No, I have to get it too. I still keep saying Garn. Someone corrected me on national radio saying that, and I was like, sorry. Yes, so anyway, the book next year, currently called The Jam Queen, but I don't know if it's going to keep that title. Yes, a good portion of that is spent on the train.
Okay, excellent. We have a comment here from Michelle. She thinks I need to rename my segment At Least 40-Minute Fridays. It doesn't have quite the same ring as 15-Minute Fridays, though, Michelle. So.
Really been that long. Oh, gosh.
Dixie has a question. Are all of your books related to food, Jo?
Yes, absolutely. So I write what I call foodie fiction or foodie lit. So all of my books are themed around food, but more than just having food in there, it's generally an artisan, an actual food artisan who's the central figure. So they're a cake maker or a coffee roaster or a tea maker or whatever they are. So that's my thing.
All right. I think we might have an offer of help here for you, Jo. Michelle Parsons has a passion for wine. Maybe she can do all that research for you.
Oh, I might have to take you up on that, Michelle. If only we could have Friday night wine tastings. That would be.
She would help. She would definitely be on board with that, I think. And we've got a thank you from Ben talking about setting. He loves it when setting brings things to life and it arouses his curiosity. Yeah. Obviously, Ben, you can tell from Jo and I talking that we're both very passionate about setting. So, yeah, we're glad that you appreciate that. Thank you so much. So I'm just checking whether we've got any more questions. We've got a few more comments. Nell wants to read your latest book. Well, get to it, Nell. I can highly recommend all of Jo's books. And I can't wait to sink my teeth into The Cake Maker's Wish. I'm waiting till my edits are in. My edits are due in the next couple of weeks. And then I'm going to just, throw everything out the window and read for like 3 weeks straight, I think. So,
we should all be sending you gift packs of chocolate and coffee right now.
Yes, please. Send chocolate. Send help.
Editing curve.
All right, Jodie has said her 3 favourite things to read and write about are food, travel, and small towns. Well, you've got that covered in spades, Jo.
Got you covered. That's great to know. They're my 3 favourite things to write about, so that works well.
There you go. And Michelle is taking you up on the wine date. There you go. All right. Oh, hang on. We've got a cheeky question here that's just come through from Jessica. Jessica joined me last week when Petronella and I were talking about editing, and I showed my pile of papers with sticky notes in it, and she wants an update. I might plead the fifth on this one, I think, Jessica. Let's go back to setting. Dear. All right, so I'm going to wrap this up, but before we do, I'll give any last chances for questions that anyone wants to pop through. And while we're doing that, I am just going to pop up all of Jo's details. Here we go. So here are Jo's books and her website, Facebook and Instagram account. If you haven't already got into Jo's books, please, please, please do yourself a favour. And it's not just about the towns and the food. There's such lovely life stories that go on in these books. And as I said, Lincoln has stayed with me, for years. I mean, I'm not sure when The Chocolate Promise came out. 2015. So that's 5 years that one has stayed with me. And when you were talking about the tea chest opening in London, I can actually still picture the description that you had, and that was even before then. So yeah, I can't recommend these books highly enough. So if there aren't any other questions, Jo and I will say goodbye. Thank you, Donna, for joining us. Jessica's laughing at me for not sharing my editing with you. Maybe next week ask me again. Hopefully I can have some good news on that. Thank you so much, Jo, for joining me. Is it going to be around this time next year that the next one is out?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, we shifted my pub date this year. I'm normally out end of March, but I had pneumonia for 2 months last year, and I just got too behind. I felt like I couldn't finish. So my publisher very kindly shifted to June. So I think yes, we'll go with June again next year. Hope so.
Excellent.
Unless I get stuck in the editing spiral and can't get out of there or something.
Yeah, that's a spiral that isn't a pleasant place to be, which I can attest to right now. So thank you again for joining me, and I can't wait to get into the Cake Maker's Wish. As I said, once I finish my edits, that's the top of my pile. And good luck with your next one, and good luck with this one. Hopefully you'll get to do some events once things settle down with COVID.
Yeah, it's a brave new world. It's all new, isn't it? And
it really is.
Best of luck with your editing. It's yeah, it's like moving mountains. I know. So I'm sure you'll get there. You've done it before. Again.
That's right. That's right. All right, guys. Thank you so much, Jo, and thanks everyone for tuning in. And I will draw the prize towards the end of the weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.